All right, Ali, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for joining me and thank you for reaching out. I really appreciate it. And I'm really excited about the conversation today. Not it's not an easy one to discuss, and not a lot of people like to think about it, but I think it's part of the human experience and something we should become. I don't know. For me, I think getting to a certain age, it's something I think about more, not from a dark perspective, but more of a realistic perspective. But before we start our conversation today, I want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and let the listeners know who you are and what it is that you do.
Yeah, thanks for so my name is Aly. I am a coach with a community development background. I am also a therapist in training. Um, but most recently in 2019, I became a widow. At 30, my husband died completely unexpectedly, and I was thrown into the world of grief without any skills or tools or real experience to know what is like to live with a devastating, life changing loss. Um, so from there, I have really dove deeply into grief psychology, doing my own work, and what I have done in that process is wrote a book called Grief Ally, helping people you love cope with death, loss, and grief. And it's really my mission to teach people kind of basic grief literacy so that we can all show up better for each other when loss and change does occur.
Right. Yeah. And thank you for sharing part of your manuscript with me, and thank you for sharing that. I guess the first question that came to my mind when I was preparing for this episode was, why was it important for you to write a book to help others understand how they can, work with their loved ones when they're dealing with grief? When So I guess there's two parts to that question. Why write the book? And then why was it important to you while you were, excuse me, dealing with your own grief?
Yeah. So I guess the first place to start in answering that question is that there are a multitude of ways that anyone processes grief. Um, and there's an some authors, Doka and Martin, have this book called Grieving Beyond Gender. So the way we grieve is actually exists on a bit of a continuum. At one end are instrumental grievers, and these are the people who are very feelings forward folks. They do well in support groups. They share spontaneous emotion. And then on the other end of that spectrum, or on that continuum, is an instrumental griever where grief is much more of a cognitive process, and they're much more likely to express their grief as more problems to solve than an
Hmm.
emotional experience. So I certainly fall on the more cognitive, instrumental side of that continuum, although most people exist somewhere like in the middle and do a balance of the two. So for me, my own grief process has been a very cognitive, scientific, searching for information and answers type process. And the way that I've been able to kind of keep the focus on that was to focus on a project. Um, and early on, it became apparent that a real problem existed in terms of there not being a single resource for folks who want to show up for someone they love who has suffered a life changing loss. There are so many tools for the bereaved themselves who are, right at the epicenter of the earthquake that has shaken their lives. But honestly, like when something really bad happens, you don't have the brain capacity to, learn new things and take on new information and try and solve that problem. But yet there are all these people in the wings saying, what do I do? How do I help? So I wanted to give those folks a resource that they could go to. They didn't have to mine the internet for answers. It's like, here is the starting place for you to give you more agency, more confidence to show up and give the person that you love and care for what they need. Um, and to be very honest, like I didn't know that it was going to be a book early on.
Yeah.
I just was like, this is a problem that I feel strongly about solving, and a book is what it turned into. Um, it was never my intention to, have a dead husband and then put it all into a book.
Right, right. Yeah, and when you talk about the intuitive grievers and the instrumental grievers on the two sides, do you feel like as you go through the grieving process, you can kind of move from one end of the continuum to the other, depending on how you're processing the grief? Because when I was kind of understanding that, to me, it was like, oh yeah, I could see myself falling on both, depending on any given day, or even how I'm evolving through the process.
Absolutely. I think we all have a blend of both within us, and it depends on a number of factors how we are expressing our grief day to day. I think a lot of it too comes from who we are with and what is our environment safe enough um, to really get down to like the deep
Right.
feelings
Yeah.
that grief comes with, certainly. And I don't, it's not a linear process either by any means. One day you could be more instrumental and cognitive, and the next day it's just it's all emotion.
Right, right. Yeah, and I did notice that because you did debunk the grief process, the 5 step process that people talk about. And it's like same with healing, right? When you see a process, quote unquote, you almost experience it as a linear thing. But
Mhm.
as we know, healing or grief is not linear. You may be angry one day, and then you may feel depressed another day, and you might accept it, but then you might fall back to that anger when you start thinking about things, or if certain things come up. And so, why was it important for you to debunk that process? And what was your experience like as you were going through your own process?
Yeah, I think it's really important to really debunk the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief, because we do have this desire to put hard things into boxes to be able to check them off and then say, okay, now it's going to be done.
Mhm.
Hard things in life don't work like that.
Right.
The older you get, the more you learn that lesson, unfortunately. And I think it's really important for people to understand that if their grief is not a linear model of healing, that there isn't anything wrong. One thing that I feel really is really important for people to know is that grief lasts forever, and to take a few steps back and really explain like what grief is. Grief comes from the fact that like we as humans attach to things,
Right.
ideas, people, and we have been doing that since we began. It's how our species has survived. So the fact that we attach is human, and because we attach, therefore grief is also human, because grief is that energy that is created within us when those attachments change, shift, transform. And we can be attached to simple things like ideas, goals, dreams, things, but then also people. And people are probably the hardest and the biggest thing that we can be attached to, because they operate independently of us, right? Um, so that change in attachment is really what grief is. It's that like internal energy that's created when that attachment shifts and changes and transforms, and from there emotions come from it. But the thing is that there's always going to be something new that reminds you of that person, which then kind of brings that attachment back, brings those
Right.
thoughts back. And so you're always going to feel something. And the only thing that would change that grief is to have the thing back that was taken away or that you lost or whatever. So grief is always going to be there. So coming back to that 5 stage model, it's important to know that there can't be 5 stages and then it be fixed, because the only thing that would fix this grief would be to have whatever you lost back. And that's
Right.
impossible. So I
Yeah.
think it's really important for people to know that even if you go through the 5 stages, even if you feel every emotion on the feeling wheel, that you're not doing grief wrong. It's just the nature of it, is that you will always feel something. Um, and it's not always bad. Sometimes, there are emotions of like of gratitude, of relief, of just pure joy in remembering something, and all that is okay. I have my therapist used the quote once, if you're going on a hike or something and you walk through a marsh and then you climb a hill and then you walk through another marsh, it doesn't mean you're not getting moving any more forward. It's just you've come across another marsh.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And the idea of attachment is interesting. And the reason why at the beginning of the episode, I said it's an interesting topic because at least for me, lately, as part of my journey, a few months ago, I started contemplating the whole notion of death and what that means. And it was uncomfortable, as you can imagine, because we have attachment to various things, right? I have
Yeah.
attachment to these things I want to achieve or accomplish in my life. I have attachment to family members, to my son. So it's like, okay, well, what does that mean if I were to die, right? And I think it's often easier to kind of think about yourself going through
Mhm.
that process, but not being on the other end of it, right? If you were to lose
Yeah.
a family member. So it was very interesting. And I think part of the reason people are very uncomfortable with the notion of death or grief is because of to your point, the attachment, but also it reminds us of our own mortality. And yeah, I think that's where a lot of people struggle. And then around the same time, I was contemplating all that. My grandma passed away, and I mean, she lived a good life, a full life, and rather than grieving it, I almost in my head celebrated it because I was able to FaceTime her, fortunately, and I could see she was ready for that next stage, and that brought me peace. And I think it was kind of interesting to go through that whole experience around the same time. But I guess it could be harder when it's sudden and not expected. So what I'm
Yeah,
trying to come is like your experience with all of that, right?
it's I'll put the asterisk in front of it is that it's all different. And it is all relative to your own experience how difficult it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Someone who loses someone they love unexpectedly and suddenly, it's hard. But someone who has to watch their loved one, die from a terminal illness or something
Yeah.
that takes their faculties away is also hard. And often, I've had conversations with people, and we would love to switch. Um, and I think so, yeah, it's all hard for sure. But coming back to these thoughts that you've had yourself, like thinking about like death and your own death, I think the thing that culturally we've done a really great job of engineering the discomfort out of our lives, so we don't end up going through these severing of attachments until later in life, when we've already had these kind of fundamental assumptions kind of built into our brains and bodies without really having to think about them. They're like unconscious assumptions that we have about how the world works. When people die, if I do the right things, I will get what I want. And death kind of calls all that into question. And you know it there are things you have to grapple with when death comes into your life, no matter what age you are. And that in itself is part of the process,
Yeah.
certainly. For me, I had the belief that people died when they were old. That
Yeah.
was the model that I had in my brain, and I thought that if I was a good person and I did the right things, that I would get to die when I was old too, and that's how everybody operated. Um, Unfortunately, I've had to grapple with that, and it's just like bad things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. And it's much more chaotic and unintentional than I expected
Right.
it to be, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Does that
Yeah,
answer the
absolutely.
question?
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. And I think it just, I think taking a step back for me when I reflect on all of that is just recognizing that we're not in control, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of these experiences are a reminder of that. And part of the reason why it is uncomfortable is that realization, right?
Yes.
So yeah. So I guess shifting a little bit here to the whole notion of the book and the
Mm,
underlying message there is really you want to equip people to be grief allies, right?
yes.
And if they know someone in their life that's experiencing grief, you're helping them with a guide in terms of understanding how they can show up. Now, that in itself is a difficult process, as you mentioned in the book. It can be exhaustive. But what are some key things you want people to understand when they're being that person, being that ally for someone else?
Yeah, I think the greatest lesson that I can give anyone is that, you're going to want to try and fix it. If you're showing up for someone that you love and care for dearly, you're going to want to fix it and you can't. And
Hmm.
that's probably the most uncomfortable part. You want to be a superhero, you want to bust down the door, you want to like get the bad guy and get this over with. You can't do that. But what you can do is that you can make their life more comfortable and easier. Like that
Hmm.
is, and also in doing that, you don't have to do everything. Um, I think there's this, for some reason, culturally, it's like, oh, you show up, you bring food, you bring flowers, a card, and a joke. And then it's like, check, 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 go to the funeral. And then, okay, now it's done. And the reality of grief is that, as we've talked about, it lasts forever. That like that after the funeral part, like there's no guidance um, at that point. So I tell people, do what you can to make people's lives comfortable and more easy. And to within that, use the strengths that you have. If you
Hmm.
are not an amazing cook or you don't want to do the food thing, that is okay. I have a friend who not inclined to spend any time in the kitchen, and that's totally fine. She is an amazing note taker. She is incredible at like research and finding answers. So that's like where she has helped me the most. In moments where I'm like, I have this meeting, my brain is not working, like, will you sit in and take notes for me? And she's like, absolutely, I will be there, I will do that for you. um I think that's the most important thing people can focus on, and where they have the most agency, for sure.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think going back to the idea of attachment, even as an ally, it's important to recognize that we're not attached to any one outcome or scenario because, as we've discussed so far, that the process is not linear, right? And as an ally, if we're attached, it could also get kind of frustrating that, oh, why is this progress not happening? And what am I doing wrong? And why is it not happening the way it should? So what are some things that, people need to keep in mind when it comes to that as well?
That's a great observation and a great question. I think the best thing that people can do is to have their own self-care process if they are
Hmm.
showing up for someone that they love. And that means, being self-aware enough to recognize that, like, hey, I am really invested in this and I'm not taking care of myself because I'm taking too much care of you. That's not probably a proper grammar, but to have that self-awareness that like this is going to be a very, very long process, and
Hmm.
to be there in the moment with your person through every up and down is not realistic. Like you will burn yourself out that way. Like you have to think about being on an airplane, you put your own oxygen mask on first. And I
Right.
think keeping the mindset that this is something that will last forever. Grief lasts forever. And sure, your person will eventually, figure out how to, you know, use the volume dial on, managing whatever energy is coming from that change in attachment for them. But for yourself, you really need to keep an eye on what's going on internally for you, because witnessing someone else's grief can also be very distressing for yourself. Like if you have had loss in your past and it didn't get the attention that it probably deserved, then it could be, a lot of stuff could be coming up for you too. um,
Hmm.
so just being aware of yourself first, and
Right.
then keeping your attention on the person that you love second, I think is an
Yeah,
important lesson.
for sure, for sure. And I think part of it is something we also learn as therapists in school, or something that we're told to keep in mind, even in our personal development as therapists, is the whole notion of compassion fatigue. So it's kind of the same idea that, you're kind of on the receiving end of working with someone, or helping someone, and it's easy to take on what they're going through,
Yes,
their stress, their emotions, their grief. And part of the whole idea of compassion fatigue is everything you highlighted, being aware of it so then it doesn't lead to burnout, and doing the things you can do for your own mental health and well-being. And there's various strategies you can deploy. But yeah, it's first of all being aware of that, because if you burn out, or if you're experiencing compassion fatigue as a grief ally, then you're probably not in a good spot to be showing up for your person, right?
exactly, exactly. And that, I think, if you've never been in a grief ally situation before, it's easy to really get caught up in the moment, in that kind of superhero mode where I want to fix this, I want to change everything. Um, so with that, I think there is an element of making mistakes and learning from those mistakes within the being a grief ally process as well. And I think that's really important to note, that if you come out too strong and then have to dial it back, like that is okay too.
Hmm.
And I think within the grief ally process, you have to have a lot of compassion for your person, but you also have to have a lot of self-compassion for those
Hmm.
mistakes that you're going to make. And it's really important to have a recovery process, for when those mistakes do happen, because they will happen. If you are close enough to your person, if you are showing up for them in the way that they need you to, you are going to make mistakes. There is
Right.
nothing you can do about that.
Yeah.
But to keep in mind that it's okay if you make mistakes and you can recover from them. And in fact, if they are with this person that you care about, your relationship will actually get stronger if you can recover from them in a meaningful way.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it would be hard if you're a perfectionist and trying to be
Yes,
a grief ally, right? Um, when you talk about the fix it kind of scenario, that resonates for me, because I think I've talked about this on the podcast too. As men, our tendency is typically to fix things, and it's been important for me to highlight to other people, but also to myself, to often take a step back. And even if it's not grief related, but if someone is struggling with something, whether it's a family member or a friend, to take a step back, and always not focus on the fixing, because whatever they're experiencing can be uncomfortable for me too. But it's trying to understand what they need in that moment, right? And as you've highlighted in your book too, that often people just need someone to listen, right? They just want to be
yes,
heard, and they don't want a solution. They just want to be able to throw all the messy emotions and the feelings out, put it on the table, and just have someone there to listen. And that's, I think, probably an important thing to be mindful of, as a grief ally as well.
absolutely. And there's a whole chapter of that, in the book, about how to be an active listener for someone. And
Hmm.
I think that there's three like really key points to active listening that are not active listening. And I think there's a bit of a misconception there. The first one is, when you're listening, that you don't say me too. All you need to do is just reflect what that person is saying. And we learn this as aspiring therapists, but just repeating back language that that
Right.
person is using can be so much more meaningful than hearing them say, like, oh, me too. That's actually like grief hijacking.
Yeah, and,
um,
and and often when the person says "me too," it's well intentioned,
of
because
course.
the mindset there is, oh, if I make this person feel like they're not alone, then they'll feel better. But why is it problematic in that context?
in when your life changes so significantly, there are people certainly who search for community, but
Hmm.
there's also people who just need that reality witnessed and reflected.
Yeah.
Just someone to say, I know how bad this is for you. I
Yeah.
recognize that this is life changing for you. And kind of when you say me too, if people are not searching for community at that point, it's a bit of like problem solving without permission, which is
Right.
another thing that we shouldn't do if when we are
Hmm.
active listening and trying to support someone. Um, if they ask because they know your story or something like, oh, did you feel this way, certainly that is an opportunity for you to enter the conversation and share your experience. But
Hmm.
if you're sharing without permission, without their consent, then you're problem solving for them when they haven't asked for it, which can actually take a lot of agency away from that
Hmm.
individual, as well as kind of um, take away the significance of their loss for them. It's a bit disenfranchising when what they really need to hear is that this is really bad, or I can see why you feel that way.
Yeah. 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 And I think part of it is also it's a myth around empathy, right? People
Mhm.
feel that if I'm able to relate to this person, then I'm demonstrating empathy. But to your point, it's doing the opposite. And I think at that point, when someone's sharing something, they don't really want to know if the other person's experienced it. I think it's just knowing that someone's there in that hole with them,
Yes.
irrespective, right? So yeah, I think that's a great point. What are the other key things to active listening?
So I've mentioned reflecting on individuals, the language that they're using. So if I say like, today feels horrible, this happened, and I feel like garbage, and
Yeah.
you can say, I'm really sorry that you feel like garbage today, like, and that can be enough. There's also immediacy behaviors that you can use. You want to be able to kind of follow the conversation. If someone is having like a stream of consciousness, just continue to let them know you're listening. So if,
Hmm.
yeah, okay, do you want to tell me more? How did that make you feel? Like just simple little things to keep them sharing if
Yeah.
it feels as though they really need to get something off their chest. And often that's really what it is. They just need an outlet to be reflected, particularly when it comes to partner loss. Partner
Right.
loss is such a tangible, intimate thing where you often do have a mirror walking around,
Mm.
reflecting what is happening in your life, someone to share that with. And when that disappears, you lose your mirror. So finding people who will be that mirror for you again is can be very valuable. Another thing to think about is that we often have this desire, I think, to be present, like physically present with the person that we want to support. We want to go over to their house, we want to sit with them on their couch. My reality was that my loss, my deepest grief really happened during COVID, which is like a whole other conversation that we could have. But that meant that a lot of the active listening that I needed had to happen on the phone or on FaceTime. Um, and there was a study done that actually showed immediacy behaviors, the verbal cues, that come, because you also
Yeah.
can do like just reflection and making sure that you're, paying, giving all your attention to the person when they need to hear you. But those verbal immediacy behaviors are actually much more effective than the visual ones. So that means that if you're talking to someone on the phone, doing the okay, yeah, I know, those are wildly more effective than being sitting with someone on their couch and asking them to share their feelings,
Right.
which makes actually talking on the phone a very, very useful tool, um, as well as thinking about neurodivergency and how our brains work. Some people don't want eye contact. Some people don't want to be touched. Some people, like, I actually I have one person that I talk to on FaceTime. Otherwise, like, I really don't like FaceTime because it's like asking me to put all my attention in one place, and I would rather like let my eyes wander because I will give you a much better answer, to something. It's also very hard for me as a more instrumental griever to share emotion. in a very face-to-face way. But if I am listening to someone on the phone, like there is that space for me to be like, okay, I am here, they are there, and now I can express myself
Right.
fully.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And kind of maybe building on that in terms of your own experience of COVID
Mm,
and not having perhaps people be able to come over or, meet at a coffee shop or whatever that may look like. Do you feel like your experience would have been different had you not gone through it during COVID?
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. In what way?
Um, many ways. There was certainly my preference for physical presence of individuals would be to like just have them around.
Yeah.
I would much prefer to go to someone's house and just kind of like exist on their couch
Yeah.
and have them do life around me, and that would have been very comforting to me to just
Hmm.
not be alone.
Right.
Um, and I think that the caliber of loneliness that I experienced in COVID is immeasurable in comparison to those that didn't have to isolate in their
Right.
grief experience. And the trouble is that we'll never really be able to compare those things. It
For
just
sure.
to me it feels as though like that would have been the dream
Right. Right.
to be
So
able to do that.
yeah, so I guess there's times where you were just wishing that you could be around people just for that presence and not necessarily for someone to kind of help you through the grief or listen to you. You just needed that physical presence that would have offered you more than enough support. And unfortunately, you weren't able to get that because of the lockdowns and all the isolation protocols. Okay, no,
Exactly. I
yeah,
think there was also like we could talk about like a a lack of physical touch. So, and I will also like put the asterisk here that I live on Vancouver Island. The majority of my best friends and family live in Ontario. My
yeah,
partner and I moved out to the island together. So yes, I have friends here, but my best friends, the people who flew in for the funeral and whatnot, like had to go home eventually. And I had intentions of visiting them, but travel became quite difficult and
for sure.
um, that sort of thing. So there is like an element of like physical touch that I was like devoid of for
Hmm.
months.
Yeah,
And whether you are a person who appreciates physical touch or not, I think there are various degrees of that. But just the opportunity to hug someone and to know that all their love is in that hug. I didn't get that. So when things started to like finally like open up, I remember like going for a massage and just that like, and that this also adds to like intimate partner loss as well,
yeah,
that someone would touch me and that first touch would be like a shudder because I had not been touched. And I think that there is a lot of co-regulation that happens. We like go down like a nervous system route conversation, but that didn't exist, and I had to do a lot of work, a lot of challenging work to try and figure out how I was going to self-regulate in this very dysregulated state while the world was completely dysregulated as well. Um, I'm not saying that COVID was easy for anyone, but those were the unique challenges that I endured.
yeah, yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. And I think that's an important thing to note because it's not something I've given much thought to. But depending on the type of grief and loss, there is that physical aspect of it too, right? That we are either attached to or we're grieving. And in your case, it was having that comfort of even just getting a hug, which you couldn't get easily. And I guess it probably even just going through or being in the midst of COVID, it probably made some of your own people that would have been able to support you, they were probably also going through their own challenges and probably created a whole different process for you, which probably would haven't existed without the pandemic, right? Yeah,
100%.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
You did mention the whole notion of community, and our immediate family and friends perhaps may not be well equipped to offer the best type of support because they may not understand what the individual's going through or what they need. But then in your case, you said you were able to find a community that was able to understand that. What was that like? And what can you offer to people that perhaps are going through their own grief and are seeking that community?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a great story, and actually part of like why I wrote the book, because so early on in my grief, I got set up with a therapist. We had one chat, and their advice was go find community. And being a 30-year-old widow, that was actually very, very difficult to find. So joining Facebook groups, there was I listened a lot, and I was having a really hard time being able to empathize with people's experience because they were talking about being forgotten and abandoned and misunderstood. And my best friends and family didn't do that. I felt very, very seen and witnessed and supported, despite the distance. They were very, very good at that, which is why I wrote the book, because I was like, I don't know where you guys are getting your answers, and they didn't either. This is just like I have
Mm,
a really emotionally intelligent group of people that I have built around me, over time. So I said, let's take these lessons and put them into a book so that other people have, some guidance in this area. Um, so I guess my first suggestion would be, if someone isn't feeling supported in their own experience of grief, like get Grief Ally for your
yeah,
for your people. Um, I think also too, it's important to remember that a loss, a death especially, affects a number of people in different ways. So there is, this not everyone's support, there will be differences in everyone's support network.
right.
So
Yeah,
for me, my partner was not best friends with all of my best friends. So they had, the distance to be able to show up for me. Whereas, immediate family members have their own grief. They need their own allies. And quite often there's this idea that, family needs to show up for each other, right after a loss. And in some cases that's not actually possible. Like if we are going through the deepest, darkest, most complex human emotions that we can experience, then, you know the mother of a son who has died and you love that son, you two are not going to be each other's support. Like
right.
it's not, it would be a lovely idea, but that grief is too intense for those two individuals, so they need their
Hmm.
own support networks. But in terms
Right.
of finding community, I mean, it's my mission that people would be able to have their own communities to build the skills, that they don't
Yeah.
have to go find others who have experienced the kind of loss that they do. But I know that some people want to do that. And unfortunately, like there's no real roadmap for that. It's a bit of trial and error, unfortunately. And to be honest, like as someone who was widowed at 30, like I am statistically insignificant. So I found it very challenging to find people who had experienced a loss like mine, but that I was also like in like similarness to. um, there's so much discrepancy among individuals that trying to find someone that has experienced what you have experienced and is also likely like you is tough.
Right.
Um, the older you get, the unfortunate thing is that more people die, and therefore there are more people who have lived experience like you do. But the younger you are, the more challenging that
Yeah.
is.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, yeah, and kind of reflecting on that, I guess with grief, there's no like age to it either, right? So I think it's something to be mindful of from that perspective. But one of the things that jumped out in terms of family, it's so important to mention that. And to your point, we were, when I was visiting family over the holidays, we experienced close family members dying in the last year, and we were talking about it and trying to figure out, well, what's the best way to respond, right? Like if like we lost our aunt and then we lost her grandma, I was like, well, what are we supposed to say to our cousins and to our uncles and stuff? And my brother was like, like it's tough for me to call people and be like, I'm sorry for your loss, because I'm also grieving. I also lost someone. And I think we get so caught up in what's the right thing to say and do. And to your point earlier, we're not mindful of giving ourselves that compassion and also permission to feel that grief, because we're focused on what the grief is feeling like other people.
Yeah,
So
exactly. I think a lot of and what we do in our culture is we focus on other people, less on ourselves. So the model that we have for grief is this like kind of outward, like this outpouring of grief support that is
yeah,
actually like not entirely helpful. It's the flowers, the go to the funeral, the send the card, the tell the joke to try and
yeah,
cheer someone up bit, right? We have far fewer role models of what the like internal grief experience looks like.
hmm,
So we don't give ourselves that permission. So that is another thing that's like just give yourself as much permission as you need to feel what comes up when you do experience, a death close to you. But then also that like, and this isn't a secret, there is no right thing to say.
right,
It's far more nuanced than that. Um, there are like a few pointers about like what not to say,
yeah,
which there's a chapter about that in the book. Um, but it is very nuanced, and I think a lot of it is like just be honest with yourself, and then be honest with the person that you are trying to support.
hmm, yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think part of it is we get really uncomfortable, as we've talked about throughout the episode here. We get uncomfortable with the whole concept of grief, and because it's not something we try to think about, it's something we avoid generally. So when something like that happens, it's so much easier to focus on other people and what they're going through rather than giving ourselves that permission and trying to experience it for ourselves. And yeah, I don't know what the right answer is. And like you said, there's no right answer. I think it's just something you have to experience fully. And yeah,
Yeah,
kind of,
and it goes back to, what I said at the beginning about making mistakes. Like you're going to make mistakes. Chances are, yeah, you're probably gonna, fumble over your words at some point. You're gonna say something that you regret. But like if you love someone enough, like apologize. Apologize and
mm,
say, I'm sorry I said that. Like that was probably the wrong thing to say at that point. I wish I had said this.
yeah,
Or I wish I had waited, 3 days before I reached out because at that point, like I was still doing a lot of processing.
yeah,
I think we get caught up in the timelines. We get caught up in trying. I think it comes down to like fixing other people, and it's about fixing our own discomfort as well. Part of that, like, oh, I'm feeling so uncomfortable. If I just say something, then this discomfort will go away.
yeah,
And this is it's a whole world that we have to work on about just
right,
embracing discomfort.
yeah.
Um, and that's really the crux of it, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it shows your human side too, right? Because we don't have all the answers as we've talked about. But for someone who was grieving, and when others came to you and perhaps apologized or felt bad for how they may have responded to certain things, how is that received? Because I would think when you're grieving, you're just appreciative of the effort people are making, and often on the other end, you may forget about that. But how was it for you, and how was it received when someone would say, "Hey, I made a mistake. I'm sorry," or "I shouldn't have said that."
Oh man, that is so appreciated.
Mhm.
I mean, for me individually, I can't speak to what how that
Yeah.
feels for other people, but um, I so Will, my partner, was very dedicated to the gym.
Yeah.
And he used to tell me that, the muscles are not made in the gym. They're made with proper rest and recovery, like when you get home. And I see that as the way that human relationships work too. We like go into the arena, we like, beat each other up with our words. And then if there is like a proper rest and recovery period where, you take a step back, be like, oof, maybe that wasn't the right thing to say. You recover from it with an apology, or like just reaching out and being like, hey, was that awkward for you? Like, did that feel not quite right? And then you have
Yeah.
a conversation about it. And I recognize that takes courage. It takes a lot of courage to be able to, reflect and then come back with those reflections. But I am so much more appreciative when someone does that rather than brushing it under the rug.
Right.
That's how we learn, right? That's how we get better at things, and that's all we can ask for,
Right.
as human beings, to learn from our mistakes and then just do better in the future.
Absolutely. And I think it brings us closer together when we have those conversations, as difficult as they are. They do go a long way because it shows that human side of us, and we're giving each other permission to be faulty and to make mistakes, but have that level of compassion and understanding for each other, which ultimately brings us closer together. So it's so important to keep that in mind. And I really like that analogy of the rest and restore. So thanks for
Yeah,
sharing that.
you're
Um,
welcome.
as we come to an end here, I do want to ask if there's anything else you want to share with listeners when it comes to grief or supporting others, or for someone that's themselves grieving. What are some things they can do?
Yeah. I don't know if I have any real like tangible stuff, but I think it really like giving yourself permission to feel whatever it is that you're feeling. We have this idea that grief is synonymous with sadness, and
Mm,
that couldn't be farther from the truth. Um, Grief is energy, and that manifests as a whole suite of emotions.
yeah,
So it is okay, whatever it is you're feeling. If they don't fall within those, 5 stages of grief model, like it's okay.
yeah,
um, I think that's really important. I think also that giving yourself agency and autonomy to do what does feel good in like deep grief. It is so uncomfortable in a grief support role. It is so uncomfortable. Figure out what it is that will kind of soothe that discomfort, in some way, without practicing self harm. But figure out what those things are, whether
yeah,
that's like weighted blankets or, ice cream, or, you know, listening to your headphones or doing yoga, cutting the grass. Like find something that will kind of soothe your nervous system, because this is a long haul. It is a long
yeah,
haul. And if you don't have something that you can hold on to that kind of brings you back to some sort of equilibrium, I'm not saying equilibrium is like you're capable of getting there, or it should be the goal. But doing something that soothes you, is really important. And then, I guess the last thing is, if this has been helpful at all, go check out the book.
yeah. No, and I think one of the things I would add, in which I gathered from your book, is everyone's process is different, right?
Yes.
So making sure that you're not judging yourself or others for how they're dealing with their grief, right? If someone needs to go for a run, sure, that's their process, right?
Yes.
And it's important not to not even judge them or yourself if you were doing that, right? Like, oh, what are people going to say that I'm already out or doing things that, does it appear like I'm insensitive or I don't care? But it's your process. And I think we often get caught up in what others are going to think as well. And it's important to just do what's best for you in those moments and being kind to yourself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Everybody's experience with grief is unique, and it depends on so many factors how someone will grieve and how they'll process. And I think that the timeline of that too is also important to recognize. If the loss was like sudden and unexpected, it could be months before you actually feel anything. So they might act normally for a very like long period of time, and then it hits.
Right.
and then they have to figure out how to do that, or it happens slower. And then also, like, just in terms of like figuring out, because grief lasts forever, it's more of just something that you learn to integrate into your life. It's not something that's going to go away, or that you move on from. And figuring out how you're going to integrate that grief into your life, how the person that you love is going to integrate that grief into their
Hmm.
life, that's a long process. It's not 2 weeks, it's not 3 months, it's not a year. It could be 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, um, in terms of trying to find how they are going to live alongside
Yeah.
that grief and that loss.
Yeah. 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 Well, Ali, I thank you for coming on here. Thank you for sharing all that. Um, thank you for the work you're doing, because it's going to help a lot of people on both ends of grief. For listeners that do want to get a hold of you and find the work you're doing, what are some ways they can do that?
Yeah, you can check out my website, which is alybird.com, and you can find me on social media at the Aly Bird. And the book is called Grief Ally: Helping People You Love Cope with Death, Loss, and Grief. And you can find that anywhere you buy books.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, we'll put all that in the show notes. It'll be available um, with the episode for people that are interested. But thank you again for doing this.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This has been a really great conversation.